Welcome, one and all, to the very first episode of Below the Salt podcast. As you may have heard in our introductory episode, we are going to be covering true crime, urban legends, and the spooky happenings here in the Beehive State. That's Utah for the uninitiated. We're Jack.
And Valerie.
And today we're going to be discussing an event that actually predates the state of Utah itself. It's an act of violence that's considered by some historians as the first ever domestic terrorist attack in the United States. The Mountain Meadows Massacre. Okay, so with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, we need to have some backstory on Mormonism. So I'm going to kind of try to keep things brief. Most locals who are going to be listening will already kind of know the story. Mormonism was founded during the Christian revivalist era of 1830 in upstate New York by Joseph Smith, who is considered a prophet and published a religious text called the Book of Mormon. Not very long after founding this new church, a pattern of local resistance and violence, followed by moving to a different state, was established. New York is where they were first founded, and then New York became Ohio, and then they moved on to Missouri, and then they moved on to Illinois, and then eventually to Utah, which at the time was technically Mexico upon their arrival in 1847. The Mormons lost several leaders within this cycle of violence that precipitated each move, including the founding prophet Joseph Smith himself, who died in Illinois in 1844. The successor Mormon prophet was Brigham Young, and he led the majority of Mormons to Utah in 1847 to avoid a total civil war with the state of Illinois. 10 years later, in April of 1857, Mormons learned that the founding church leader and apostle Parley P. Pratt had been killed in Arkansas by a group of locals, including a local named Hector McLean. Hector McLean was the legal husband of one of Pratt's plural wives, as you may know, that polygamy was a part of the early Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, McLean was the legal husband of one of Parley P. Pratt's plural wives, Eleanor McLean Pratt, and he was the one who ultimately shot and killed Pratt himself. Many Mormons in Utah held the people of Arkansas responsible for this martyrdom, and took the news as another example of religious persecution, and considered Pratt a martyr. Mormon leaders taught that God would soon exact punishment against the United States for persecuting Mormons, and many Mormon apostles and other leaders considered it their religious duty to kill the prophet's murderers if they ever came across them.
Around that same time, a group of 120 immigrants from Arkansas known as the Baker-Fancher Party started the long trek to California. This group was relatively wealthy and planned to restock its supplies in Salt Lake City, as most wagon trains did at that time.
Mm-hmm.
The party reached Salt Lake City, where it was reported to Brigham Young that they were from Arkansas.
So, yeah, there's a little bit of tension there with people from Arkansas.
With Parley P. Pratt.
Yeah, well, and also, I think Salt Lake is kind of at this, intersection of, it currently to this day is at this intersection of I-80 and I-15, which are two of the main transcontinental interstates. But even back at that time, this was a place where you either decided to go to Oregon or to go to Southern California with the established trails. So everyone stopped in Salt Lake to get the supplies they needed to move on. So, yeah.
So it was reported to Brigham Young that they were from Arkansas.
Not good.
And a rumor also started that Eleanor McLean Pratt, remember, who was one of the plural wives, recognized someone in the party that was traveling there as part of the group that killed her husband, even though she wasn't present at the murder.
So she wasn't present at the murder, but someone started a rumor that she had pinned out one of these Baker-Fancher people as a member of the martyrdom group that killed her husband.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good that someone's starting lies about this group from Arkansas that are just passing through.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Anyways, in July, while the Baker-Fancher party was en route to Utah, to the territory that would become
Yeah,
Utah.
because Utah didn't become a state until I think the 1890s.
Yeah.
So this is about 30 years before that.
Well, Mormons began hearing rumors that the United States had launched an expedition to invade the territory and depose its theocratic government.
Yeah, because Brigham Young was was the governor of Utah Territory, and he's also the prophet and leader of the church at the time. So that doesn't really jive with the whole religious.
Yeah, and the relationship between the Utah government and the federal government had been really weird and deteriorated quite a bit for the 10 years before that.
Yeah, because
polygamy was a big issue.
And there were other things. I mean, the fact that that he was the political ruler and the religious ruler was kind of contrary to a lot of political thought in back in the States. And even when they first got there in 1847, it was Mexico. It only became Utah Territory a few years after that. So it's kind of it's a really murky situation, and the United States was not super happy about what was going on out there. So yeah.
At that time, Brigham Young was replaced by Alfred Cumming. And also, a whole quarter of the entire U.S. Army were already on their way.
Oh, so the rumor that the United States was sending an army was a true rumor. So they were sending.
It was a trumor.
A trumor, yeah. Ooh, I can feel a trumor in the ground, in the force. That's interesting. A quarter of the entire U.S. Army, and this is right before the Civil War. So there's a pretty big army, right?
It was basically like the apocalypse was starting. Mormons saw it as a threat to their whole existence and way of life.
At least to the people in Utah, yeah.
It was like the sky was starting to fall.
Yeah, well, I mean, if someone told me that a quarter of the U.S. government or the U.S. Army was coming for my community, I'd be a little concerned.
And it just so happens that Brigham Young had predicted a 7-year siege and had people starting to prepare for that already. In preparation for that siege that Brigham Young had predicted, Mormon leaders began accelerating a program that already existed for stockpiling grain. And so the rest of the Mormons were told to stockpile and to buy as much grain as possible and to not sell it to immigrants. They did not want this traveling party to have any of their grain or supplies.
Which is interesting because, like I said, that's probably a big part of their incoming money to the state was people passing through and buying grain from them.
Yeah, but when you think
the world's coming to an end,
the world is coming to end. Yeah, they definitely want to look out for their own.
Yeah.
On August 5th of that year, 1857, Brigham Young declared martial law, and all the borders were sealed to further travel through Utah by immigrants.
On August 5th.
The Baker-Fancher party weren't aware of that decree yet because it wasn't made public until September 15th.
Okay, so he tells everyone He declares martial law and he doesn't tell anyone for like a month and a half. Great, that's super helpful for the people who were stuck in his state at the time. So evidently this friction that was caused by the whole martial law and the telling people not to sell to passers through added to the range war. For lack of a better word, a range war is,
it means that they want to have enough food for their livestock, for their cattle.
That's coming through with the party.
And because the Baker-Fancher party also has livestock and cattle, the locals were worried that they would be competing. So that's kind of what the range war is they're getting ready to...
They're like, this is my land, you can't let your livestock come and trample my stuff and eat my cow's food, basically. Okay, so... apparently it got so bad that sometimes the Baker-Fancher's livestock would break through the Mormon fences.
Because they were starving.
Yeah, of course. So, and that no one was selling to them, so it's not like they could ask nicely.
Correct.
This whole problem with them breaking fences was also complicated by the fact that that the Mormons had stopped government surveyors from coming in and laying down boundaries between Mormon territory, Native American territory, and the United States territory.
So they basically could just say, hey, this land is mine, even if it wasn't, and
right, even if it was
there'd
been
be
promised.
No way to tell.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of those surveyors that were already in the state had been kicked out or murdered.
Literally murdered government agents. So that's good. So of course, that whole dispute is fueling some of the panic that's going on. Brigham Young, along from being the leader of the Mormon Church and being the governor of Utah Territory.
Former governor.
Yes, he was. I think he was recently. Yeah, he had just been deposed.
Replaced. But he was still in charge.
Oh yeah, like I mean, at that time you ruled the church, you ruled the people. He was also the superintendent of Indian Affairs in Utah Territory, which means that he was in charge. If you had a problem with Native Americans attacking your land, or you're one of the Mormon immigrants and you need to basically, if you need to take over land from Native Americans, you go talk to Brigham Young and he goes and makes sure that the land gets taken over for you. So it's not a good thing, but it did mean that he did have diplomatic ties to the leadership of the Native American tribes in the area. When it became clear that that an invasion by the U.S. was actually going to happen, that quarter of the entire army was on the way, he actually reached out to the Native American tribes of the area to join the Mormons in fighting against the Americans, because of course the Native Americans are probably not super happy about the United States at the time. He also instructed the tribes that it would be totally okay if they stole the livestock of any of the immigrants passing through. He elaborated on this plan once in a message to Mormon apostles on August 16th, 1857. He said, "The Gentile immigrants will shoot the Indians wherever they meet them, and the Indians will now retaliate and kill innocent people." So he kind of saw it as a win-win, that they would get rid of those pesky immigrants that are coming through, and that the Indians would be blamed for it. Which is
great double cross.
Which is a great double cross. It's also a dick move, like a total dick move. I mean, these people are
considered a dick move.
It is, and brood culture and human culture actually. So it's just like he could have just been like, "Hey, just let him through." Like like he could have.
They were trying to get to California. They weren't even going to do anything.
Yeah, they just wanted to, if you had just been cool about it, then probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But that didn't happen. So the Baker Fanchers were making their way through Utah. They passed through Parowan, which is pretty close to the center of the. It's like south central Utah, and Cedar City.
And that's southern Utah.
Yes, that's getting closer to St. George, which is the extreme southern end of Utah. These southern Utah communities of Parowan and Cedar City were led by stake presidents William Dame and Isaac Haight. And stake presidents are essentially the local leaders. It's basically as high up as you can go without being with an apostle or a 17.
In the LDS church, there's your ward, which are like all your neighbors who are in your territory that go to church at the same time as you do.
It's the smallest possible congregation.
Yes, and then the stake is a collection of wards.
Right, and then
it's
so
it's like
a city.
A stake president is like a district manager.
Yeah, as opposed to a local store manager. Yeah, okay.
And they were also militia leaders.
Yes, not only did they control the church, but they also controlled the military of the area, which is the same problem that Brigham Young has up in Salt Lake City. So, as the Baker Fanchers approach, on Sunday, September 6th, Isaac Haight, who is the stake president of Parowan,
Cedar City.
Oh, of Cedar City, yep. Thank you for correcting me. That's right. Held a weekly stake high council meeting, which means that he met with all of his people that were all the local bishops and the local leaders in his stake, and he brought up the issue of what to do with the immigrants that are on their way. At that meeting, a plan to fake a Native American massacre was discussed, but thankfully, not all of the council members agreed that it was the right approach. Which makes sense. It's like, yeah, we could just not kill these people. That's an idea. However, following the council, Isaac Haight decided to send a messenger south to John D. Lee.
Yeah, the D stands for Dick.
Yeah, John
Dick
Major
Lee.
Dick Lee. God, what a jerk. He's a local leader, and he was the Indian agent, much like Brigham Young was up in Salt Lake City.
From Parowan.
So he
was also the adopted son of Brigham Young. So of course he's like
royalty,
the
basically.
Same job. And,
yeah.
Ugh.
He's basically Utah royalty down there. So we don't really know exactly what Haight said to Lee in this correspondence, but considering the timing, it probably had something to do with disregarding what the council had decided about not attacking.
And faking a massacre anyways.
Right.
Ugh.
So the noose is definitely tightening for these people.
Definitely.
They're kind of walking into a trap, and the local tension of this area was already so tight with everything going on that they just needed one little thing that I think mostly is this Arkansas connection with the Baker Fanchers to just snap and cause some...
Yeah, just push them right over the edge.
Yeah, it's just really, really unpleasant. Oh, hi! The dog just jumped on the table, so I'm just gonna pull her off there.
What a stink.
She is a stink. Little scruffy little thing. Okay. She's back on the floor now. Alright. So the Baker Fanchers found water and fresh grazing for their livestock after reaching a grassy, mountain-ringed area called the Mountain Meadows, which is a widely known stopover on the old Spanish Trail from Salt Lake City to Southern California.
In the Mountain Meadows, this is only like 40 miles from the Utah border, right? Like
yeah,
40 more miles and they wouldn't even be in Utah anymore.
Yeah, it's actually just north of St. George, which is basically on the border of Utah and Nevada.
Yeah.
And it's so, like, 40 more miles, and they don't even need to worry about anything anymore.
40 more miles. They have grass for their livestock. There's fresh water there. So they decide to camp there for a couple of days.
Yeah, because they gotta
rest up a little bit,
because not only have they had a long, hard journey, but they've also been having a little trouble with the locals. So on September 7th, the party was attacked by Mormon militiamen dressed as Native Americans and members of the local Paiute tribe. They were presumably brought by Indian agent John Dick Lee. Yeah. Who is just a piece of shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, yeah.
So they were getting attacked already, and they had been there for, like, what, a day?
Yeah, they'd only just gotten there. And they were actually, well, we'll get into it, but they're too far away. They had camped just far enough away from the water that they couldn't get more water when they were being attacked.
No.
The Baker Fancher party defended itself as most parties did at this time when they were under attack by other forces, by encircling and lowering their wagons. So they'd make a big circle with their wagons, and I think they would take the wheels off, or they'd lower them somehow. There's some sort of mechanism to do that. They'd chain the wheels together, and they would dig shallow trenches and throw dirt below and into the wagons.
Interesting.
So that's kind of like a pioneer mobile fortress that they kind of threw together, and it's actually super creative. I mean, the little wood wagon probably doesn't block bullets super well without having some dirt in it, so it makes sense that they'd create a little fortress for themselves. So 7 immigrants were killed and 16 were injured during the opening attack, right when the first wave of militiamen and Native Americans
and there were like 100 or so, right?
There were 120 total.
Okay.
And right at the beginning.
Okay, so now there's only like 109.
Yes, that's correct. And so the dead were actually buried within the circle of the wagons.
Grody.
Yeah. So not only do you have...
I get it.
Yeah, I mean, you do need to bury them.
What else are you going to do? Yeah.
And if they're far enough down, you don't have to deal with, putrefaction, that sort of thing. This attack actually continued for days.
Wow.
It started on a Monday, which was the day after that stake council meeting. And it lasted until Friday. So they were there in that circle for 4 days. They didn't have. They were running out of food. They had like stock food. They had like flour and whatnot, but they didn't have game food, so they couldn't hunt deer obviously within their little circle. And they also didn't have access to fresh water. No. So without fresh water, you're not going to make it.
Not very
many days.
Yeah.
And they were also starting to run out of ammo, which of course is a very important thing to have when you're under attack from a militia. As those 4 days went on, the local Mormon leadership started breaking down. The militia leaders who were attacking. They were pretty sure that the Baker Fanchers had noticed that they weren't actually Native Americans, which of course they could, because it's pretty obvious. I mean, I feel like I would be like, that's not a Native American. That's some dude. And it could have been. They could have even have seen people they'd already met, because they'd already passed through these communities that were attacking them.
Yeah.
So.
That's interesting. I didn't think about that.
Yeah. So they knew that if the Baker Fanchers made it out of the Utah Territory, they would report what had happened to the Nevada State Authority or the Nevada Territory authorities. Yeah. So, eventually, and we don't know who issued this order. A lot of people assume it's John D. Lee. Eventually, the raiding party was ordered to kill all of the immigrants. Just slaughter every single one of them, so that they couldn't testify against them. And it's just like, why did you even bother in the first place, you guys? So why couldn't you have just let them go? On Friday, sorry, it's just really sad. On Friday, September 11th.
September 11th.
It's all connected.
Oh no.
No, it's not all connected, except for maybe a theme of religious extremism. That's connected.
Okay.
Well, and when you hear like two kind of like vicious attacks happened on the same day, you get that. What's that? There's this
apophenia.
Apophenia. It's the phenomenon of pattern recognition in the brain.
Conspiracy brain.
Yeah, we call it conspiracy brain. It's like, oh, it must be connected, because why else would they happen on the same day? Yeah, they happen on the same day because it's just a huge coincidence.
It's like when you think about buying something on Amazon, and then a day later there's an ad for it on your Facebook, and you're like, oh my god, somebody's bugged my brain.
Yeah, I have a chip in my brain, and Amazon's clued into it.
Even though it's really just a coincidence, because you probably saw something that reminded you of it, and that's why you were thinking about buying it in the first place.
Well, it's a very real phenomenon, apophenia, and it's
important to survive, because it's like recognizing patterns of poisonous snakes and insects and
or like
food.
If you see a cougar you saw a cougar once a long time ago, and then a day later you see another cougar, you should know that you're being stalked by a cougar, and you should be wary of it.
Apophenia. Yeah, and
it's
more you know.
Translated into our modern society into conspiracy theories, which is great. We'll talk more about conspiracy theories. That's something we're looking forward to.
We have a few episodes coming up with that. But anyways, so September 11th.
Yes.
And it's 1857 still.
Yes.
And it's 5 days after the siege began, right?
Yeah, they attacked starting on Monday, and it is now Friday. So, 2 militiamen and the militia leader, John D. Lee, John Dickless Lee.
Fucking John
Lee. I hate that guy. Approached the Baker Fancher party wagons waving a white flag, which is a sign of peace. Yes, the white flag was a huge lie, of course. Lee told the battle-weary immigrants that he had negotiated a truce with the Paiutes, and which they would respect that because he is an Indian agent for the area. And that they were going to be escorted safely back to Cedar City in exchange for turning all of their livestock and supplies over to the Native Americans.
That sounds like a setup.
It's a total setup, but of course they're going to be like, if we get to live, you can have our stuff, you jerks. So, the Baker Fanchers, despite having very limited options, accepted and were led out of their fortification. And this is where you're going to want to brace yourself for the pain.
Warning.
Yeah, content warning. The adult men were separated from the women and children. The men were paired with a militia escort, and when a signal was given, the militiamen turned and shot the male members of the Baker Fancher party standing by their side. The women and children were then slaughtered with bullets and arrows by an ambush party hiding in bushes and ravines. Out of the 120 members of Baker Fancher that walked into the Mountain Meadows area, only about 15 survived.
Wow.
and so that's about 105 roughly.
Just each brutally murdered.
Just murder, executed. Just totally, completely executed. No mercy. Not for women, not for most of the children.
Wow.
The 15 that did survive were children who were 7 years old or younger. And I heard a lot of people think that that's about the fact that, oh, you're jumping on the table again, you stinker. A lot of people think that the 7-year age thing has to do with the Mormon age of accountability. Mormons believe that when you turn 8 years old, you are accountable for your actions, and you can choose to be baptized.
Yeah, exactly, and become a full-fledged member.
Correct. And if before you turn 8, you are basically living without sin. You can't sin. You're not. You don't have the capacity. However, upon research, a lot of people believe that the real reason is that you could not testify in court in United States territories or states unless you were 8 or over.
Interesting.
So a lot of people think that it was more about the legal ramifications rather than the spiritual ramifications of their actions.
I wonder if that is a big part of why 8 is the age, though.
You know, it might have been because that was probably established right around the same time.
There's definitely some shady stuff going on in the early days of the church.
In Salt Lake City,
So I wonder if that's why they chose it, because then they feel that more a bigger sense of loyalty after they've been baptized, so they wouldn't want to testify anyways.
It's entirely possible. Yeah.
Interesting.
Or it could be apophenia and a total coincidence, and we just would never know. Yeah, but we'll find out. Maybe we'll dig into that and do like a follow up.
Yeah. Anyways, so only 15 kids survived.
Yes.
And they were all under 8 years old.
7 or younger.
Ugh, that's horrible.
There's actually there's a Netflix series called what was it called? Godless.
Godless, that's right. That has great.
Michelle Dockery in it, who from Downton Abbey, who's fantastic. And in this story, John, I think is it John Voight's character? Is it John Voight?
I don't remember.
One of the it's Jeff Daniels. Jeff Daniels' character said he was one of these children who survived the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
That's right.
And he remembers all the experience, and he's kind of a little. That's like part of his built-in backstory, which is interesting.
That's right. It's a good show. People watch it.
It's really good. We highly recommend it. It's a great twist on a western.
Netflix sponsor us.
Yeah, Netflix, send us free stuff. The surviving children were taken in by local Mormon families, which is horrific to think about. That the people who murdered your parents
are now gonna
raise you, or horrific to think that you just got murdered and your kid is gonna get raised by your murderer. The bodies of the victims were some of the bodies of the victims were hastily buried, and the property of the dead was split by the Native Americans involved as essentially payment for their participation, and by the Mormons in southern Utah, including our friend John D. Lee.
Oh my God.
Who we love. Just kidding, we hate him. Members of the militia were sworn to secrecy, and a plan was set to blame the massacre on the Native Americans.
Oh my God.
Because, there are arrows here. It must have been Native Americans, right? It must have been a big attack.
Yeah, that's horrible.
So, it's this level of bloodshed, like, I mean, it's easy to be desensitized by a lot of the stuff that's been going on in our world today. But 100 people getting slaughtered like this was beyond the pale. I mean, it's beyond the pale today, but back then, it was unheard of that 100 people would just get slaughtered for no reason.
For no reason, except for
during a battle in a war.
Yeah.
That's the only time numbers like this were ever heard of.
And a war started from fucked up ideology.
Yes, and just like the fact that everyone was freaking out about being under attack. They weren't thinking rationally, and part of it was because they felt like they were being persecuted, and they felt like they were taking revenge for the loss of one of their leaders, and it just created a really unhealthy environment for both the people living there and the people passing through.
Jeez.
So, there were 3 total investigations into the events of September 11th, 1857. The first was conducted by Brigham Young.
Oh, that's not gonna be biased.
Yeah, no. Who? What do you think he thought happened?
Probably thought that Native Americans attacked the party, right?
Yes, he did. He concluded that the massacre was the work of Native Americans. So we know that is total bullshit.
Jeez.
He probably had John D. Lee investigate it. You know what I mean? Because he was the Native American agent at the time.
Oh, brother.
So yeah, of course John D. Lee's like, yeah, it totally was the Native Americans. We feel so bad about it.
Even there.
Yeah, I didn't personally murder all these people. In 1859, so that's 2 years later, the U.S. Army had come to Salt Lake City and had deposed Brigham Young as the governor, and the leader of that was a U.S. Army Major James Henry Carleton and Jacob Forney, who became the new superintendent of Indian Affairs for Utah after Brigham Young had been kicked out of that position as well. And
he was just from the U.S. Army?
Yeah, they were both from back east.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah, these are both like relatively unbiased parties.
Nice.
So I'll talk about Carleton's investigation first. He's the U.S. guy and the Army guy, and the other guy is the Indian Affairs guy. So Carleton, James Carleton, found women's hair tangled in sagebrush, and the bones of children still in their mother's arms.
Oh my God.
He later said it was a sight which can never be forgotten. After gathering up the skulls and bones of those who had passed, Carleton's troops buried them and erected a cairn and cross monument. He interviewed a few Mormon settlers nearby and Paiute Native American chiefs and concluded that there was, in fact, Mormon involvement in the massacre. Carleton's report to the U.S. Congress called the mass killings a heinous crime, blaming both local and senior church leaders for the massacre.
Yep, that's so sad. The bones in their arms.
Yeah, like that was...
Like, that's horrible.
Purely no mercy. Like,
no.
They were obviously terrified of being caught up in this attack. Maybe they didn't even initially intend on killing all of them, but by the time they were a few days in and they realized that these people could easily escape to the safety of Nevada, it was... They felt
I feel like
pressured.
Since the people were involved were also the people who had been a part of the meeting the Sunday before, where it was decided not to do that. But then those ones went up to Brigham Young and maybe had a little meeting that we don't know about.
I don't think he could have made it all the way up to Salt Lake City before the Monday after when they attacked.
Could you not get a message up there?
I don't think so. They didn't even have telegraph lines at that time.
Interesting.
But we do know...
that just means even more that they're acting on their own and they have an agenda.
These people were pretty much single-handedly responsible.
I feel like they probably planned to kill everybody.
Yes, they very well might have. Brigham Young, as far as being personally responsible for what happened, definitely we don't think he issued any orders or anything like that. But he did create the environment where this could easily happen. So he has a level of personal responsibility here. Yeah, it's pretty dark. Okay, so that's the first investigation. The second investigation is Jacob Forney, who's the new superintendent of Indian Affairs. Forney's investigation included visiting the region in the summer of 1859 and retrieved many of the surviving children of massacre victims who had been housed with local Mormon families. So they had been with those families for 2 years.
Wow.
Before he got them all, and he returned them to their relatives in Arkansas.
Oh.
So
that's so sad.
It's so sad. Can you imagine like finding out about that as like your relatives?
Well, the relatives in Arkansas probably didn't even know that the specific child that they related to was even alive.
Yeah, they probably assumed that they had passed.
Yeah, they probably just heard about the massacre and a couple kids had survived, but there's no way to tell if it was the one that was in your family.
Right. So, Forney concluded that the Paiutes did not act alone in the massacre, as Brigham Young had concluded, and the massacre would not have occurred without the white settlers, which is an important distinction to make.
So 2 out of 3 investigations
say that the Mormons are highly involved, and one of them says that it wouldn't have happened without them. So, Judge John Cradlebaugh, which is actually kind of a fun name, right? I like that name. If you're gonna be a judge, you need a good name like Cradlebaugh. Convened a grand jury in Provo in 1859. So he is a U.S. judge.
Okay.
He's not
a local.
I think he actually is a local, but he works under the authority of the governor.
Okay.
The new governor, Cummings,
US.
I think is his full name. Yes. Concerning the massacre, the jury declined to indict anyone.
Oh.
So the jury definitely took Brigham Young and the local leader's side and refused to even bring up charges.
Wow.
Cradlebaugh attempted to have John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, and John Higbee arrested, but they fled the state before they could be found.
Innocent.
Yes, that is what all innocent people do. Cradlebaugh publicly charged Brigham Young as an instigator, not as a participant, but an instigator.
All right. Okay.
And had him arrested.
Better than nothing.
Yes, but no federal charges ensued because no jury would ever indict the prophet of their church, and Brigham Young was released. Further investigations were cut short by the Civil War in 1961. So right after all these arrests happened, Civil War breaks out. So everything gets put on hold. But to their credit, they start back up again after the Civil War in 1871. The investigation continued and led to the arrest of our friend John D. Lee in 1874. He was the only person to actually face the law for the crime. He was convicted in 1876 and sentenced to death.
Wow.
At his sentencing, Lee chose execution by firing squad. At that time, and actually up until very, very recently, if you were sentenced to death in the state of Utah, you could choose your method of execution, which is super morbid, but also like it kind of cool. Like, I don't know. What do you think? If you got executed, would you be like, hey, you get to weigh your options? What would you choose?
I mean, I guess it depends on my exact options. If I knew what was
the options,
not gonna hurt.
Yeah, that's true. The options at the time,
right, were being shot, hung, or beheaded.
Yes.
And out of all those,
I think beheaded or shot. I feel like hanging, you'd be alive for a little while, and that would be kind of freaky.
You know what, I wonder
and
about
going
shot
up to the
too, like.
You get shot in the heart.
Execute you?
No, they shoot you.
Looking at you?
They put hoods on and they shoot you in the heart from a distance.
And I just would rather not be put to death.
Well, yes, I don't think that's an option for John D. Lee at this point.
Good.
But me personally, I'll go with no.
Cool.
It was carried out in 1877.
Good.
And at the time, Brigham Young stated that John D. Lee's fate was a just fate, but it was not a sufficient blood atonement given the enormity of the crime. The blood atonement is a very interesting principle that the early Mormon Church believed. They don't consider it doctrine today, but at the time of Brigham Young, they believed that if you committed a capital crime, and the actual crime is a little murky. It's definitely murder, but also I think a few other crimes might have qualified for this blood atonement thing. They believed that the only way that you could atone for your sin was to also die, or to be executed. There are rumors, and there's some very well substantiated rumors that Brigham Young had groups of people in Salt Lake City that would fulfill these blood atonements called Danites. There's this kind of secret group of police that would go around and carry out some of these blood atonements on people who were considered liable for it. So
nearly 20 years passed, right, since the massacre, and
yes, 20 years.
John D. Lee got
John D. Lee was executed.
And this whole time, Brigham Young really probably didn't say anything about him, and then when he finally gets executed, he's like, "Oh, it wasn't blood atonement though, because the crime is so severe."
Yeah, because 100 people died, 105 people. Until
that point, until he was already dead, he never said anything like that.
Well, he could have said something, but it's not a matter of record. You know, like he doesn't.
To his own adopted son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the ideas of choosing your execution method and blood atonement are something that will kind of inform Utah's really weird relationship with capital punishment.
Yeah, capital punishment is really weird here.
It's weird everywhere because just the idea
capital
of it.
Punishment is weird.
But Utah has a very interesting. We'll talk about it a little bit in episode 3. That the first person to get executed after the federal stay on executions in the 70s was here in Utah, Gary Gilmore. So, we will kind of dig into capital punishment throughout the podcast a little bit. So yeah, the only person who faced justice for all these crimes, despite the fact that at least several hundred militiamen participated, was John D. Lee. So, Major Carlton's monument that he built over the bones that he found in 1859 was found destroyed. The locals in the area had destroyed the monument that he built to memorialize the deaths that had taken place there. So apparently there were still some pretty hard feelings among the locals even after they had killed off all these people, and they decided to take it out on the monument.
Yeah, that's fucked.
Super fucked up to do. Like, not cool. Like, it's bad enough that you killed the people, but you have to desecrate their grave? Good God. Anyway, the structure was actually replaced by the U.S. Army in 1864, so 5 years later, which is really cool. It's cool that the Army felt that responsibility and did that. Wilford Woodruff, who actually later became the president of the church, I think he was the 4th. So it was Joseph Smith, then Brigham Young, then John Taylor, then Wilford Woodruff, who we're talking about here. He claimed that when he was reading the inscription on the cross, which said, "Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord, I shall repay," which was written on it by the Army, Brigham Young responded, "It should say, the vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little."
Oh my God.
So, like, Brigham Young basically thinks he's, like, the god of Utah, and it's like, yeah, I got to take out a little bit of vengeance of my own.
What a piece of work.
Yeah, he's like a total megalomaniac. He's a monster. And hey, look, one of our local colleges is named after him. That's great. Super, super cool. Jeez, what a garbage heap. Okay, the Mountain Meadows Association, composed of descendants of both the Baker Fancher Party victims and, actually, strangely enough, the Mormon participants, built a new monument in 1990.
Oh, that's good.
Which is kind of a cool, like, hey, let's, like, bury the hatchet together.
I like that.
Because it's not like the descendants of the people who participated.
Yeah, and so many people here don't like to even talk about this whole event. So I like that there is a little association that does still acknowledge it and is making peace like that.
Absolutely. So they built a new monument in 1990. And actually, in 1999, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the modern Mormon church, replaced the U.S. Army's cairn with a second monument.
Good.
Which is good, but it kind of gets a dark turn here.
Oh no!
During the construction of the monument, the remains of at least 28 massacre victims were accidentally dug up by a backhoe. The forensic evidence showed that the remains of the males had been shot at close range, and the remains of the women and children mostly showed evidence of blunt force trauma.
No!
So they were.
So our modern forensics confirmed 2 of the 3 reports.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. At the dedication of the monument, the current Mormon prophet, Gordon B. Hinckley, said the following: "That which we have done here must never be construed as an acknowledgement on the part of the church of any complicity in the occurrences of that fateful day." So he's like, hey, even though we're building this monument, we're still not responsible for what happened here. Like, totally deferring responsibility. Even up until 1999.
Jeez.
Which is just like, you could at least be like, yeah, we're sorry this happened. But he had to throw in a little thing saying that, yeah, this is not our fault. Even though they're the ones who fostered that environment. Yeah, it's like, you couldn't have just like unabashedly, oh my goodness, that is the 3rd time that stinker dog has been jumping on the table. Can't believe you. She's funny. She's really dumb though. So
real dumb.
So, like, telling her not to jump on the table is not going to happen. Okay, so, the Baker Fancher Party, they had 2 options to reach California when they arrived in Salt Lake City. The northern route put them at risk of being snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains, as the Donner Party had happened to them 10 years before. We actually will be talking about the Donner Party as part of their misadventures did take place in the state of Utah. The southern route went through the Old Spanish Trail, which took them through the settlements in southern Utah, and then through southern Nevada, and eventually into Los Angeles. At least one couple of the Baker Fancher Party, Henry D. and Melinda Cameron Scott, chose to take the northern route, while others from the woman's family took the route south. So they decided to take.
Separated.
They separated.
You're never
and took
supposed
the
to separate.
Yeah, that's rule number 1 in horror movies. And traveling.
Did this couple survive?
They did survive.
They made it all the way to California.
They made it all the way to California, and they took the kind of the scarier route through the Donner Pass.
That is so sad.
Yeah. So, it's just interesting how life goes. Sometimes you take a riskier route, and it ends up paying off, and sometimes you take the safe route, the well populated route,
and you get massacred by the locals.
You get killed by locals. So,
brother.
With that little nugget, we're going to wrap things up here on the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
This is Below the Salt.